Today we will look at what makes a commercial lease tenant-friendly. This is the first module in our video guide series. This topic is important to you, as tenants need to ensure that their leases help their business and do not harm their business. Regrettably, tenant-unfriendly leases have caused great harm to many businesses. A recent example is that very few tenants had lease terms that protected them during the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in tenant rent obligations continuing, notwithstanding the restrictions on utilization. This video is a high-level overview of what makes a commercial lease tenant-friendly. In your client portal, you'll find a user guide with far more detail on this important topic. We have 3 objectives for you as you view this video guide. Namely, that you will understand what we mean by a tenant-friendly lease. And secondly, that you will distinguish between tenant-friendly and tenant-unfriendly lease terms. And thirdly, that you will review the user guide on this topic and apply the principles to your lease negotiations. Let's start then by explaining what we mean by a tenant-friendly commercial lease. A tenant-friendly commercial lease is a lease with commercial terms that are optimally aligned with your business requirements and your business risks over the term of the lease. 2 aspects of this definition are important to you as a tenant. Firstly, the definition makes the point that a tenant-friendly lease is aligned with your business requirements and your business risks. Now, this implies that lease terms that work for one tenancy do not necessarily work for another tenant. For example, if you are opening a new store and you're not sure that the location will work, the most important commercial term in your lease may well be a cost-effective right to terminate early, if needed. On the other hand, for a stable business whose goodwill is tied to a particular location, the most important terms would be a long lease with multiple options to renew, together with lease terms that ensure that the occupancy costs are market-related throughout the lease term. Secondly, the definition says that a tenant-friendly lease is optimally aligned with your requirements and your risks. Now, the reason we say optimally is that a perfect outcome is not achievable simply because landlords and tenants have conflicting interests. Now let's take a closer look at what makes a lease tenant-friendly. This is the right time to introduce the LPC barometer, which we use to guide our lease negotiations on behalf of a tenant. We encourage you to apply the barometer to your lease and to any leases that you negotiate in the future. Now, as you can see from the slide, the barometer highlights that negotiated lease terms end up somewhere between favouring the landlord and favouring the tenant. Our aim, and of course your aim, is to achieve lease terms that favour the tenant's business. We use the 5 criteria of cost, risk, flexibility, obligations and guarantees to help the tenant determine what lease terms are most important for their particular business and to guide their particular lease negotiations. Now, a few words about each of these 5 criteria. Why they are 5 criteria for a tenant that matter and what our aim is for each of these criteria. Firstly, cost. Our aim is that the tenant occupancy cost is favourable throughout the lease term. You would regard this as tenant-friendly. Then risk. Our aim here is that the landlord shares in the risks related to the utilization of the premises. Again, this is tenant-friendly. Flexibility. Our aim here is that the tenant can expand or contract as their business expands or contracts. We would regard this as tenant-friendly. Obligations. Our aim here is that the tenant obligations are clear and contained. Again, this is tenant-friendly. Now, what about guarantees? Our aim here is that the tenant guarantees are clear and are limited. Again, we would regard this as tenant-friendly. Now, I refer you to the user guide in your client portal, which has tables that apply the barometer to each of these 5 criteria in a detailed and specific way. In this introductory video, I will use just one of the 5 criteria, namely risk, to illustrate how we use the barometer to keep negotiations on track towards a tenant-friendly outcome. Let's talk about risk. In the pursuit of a tenant-friendly lease, it's essential to negotiate lease terms that mitigate risks for the tenant. Now, these risks include rent continuing whilst utilization is impaired, or occupancy cost increasing above the market rate during the lease term, or getting stuck with more space than you need during the lease term without a correlating adjustment to rent. Now, COVID-19 has reinforced the reality of these risks for most tenants. The slide illustrates how we apply the barometer to guide our and your lease negotiations. In orange, you'll find a list of the major utilization and business risks that affect tenancy. The blue arrow points to lease provisions that are landlord-friendly and which need to be avoided. And the yellow arrow points to lease provisions that are tenant-friendly and which need to be pursued. For example, in relation to the risk of premises devaluing over the lease term, the tenant should seek landlord warranties to mitigate the risk of premises decline. Now, achieving these provisions requires clear thinking and skilled negotiations. In the user guide, the tables for the other criteria work in exactly the same way, providing an excellent guide to your lease negotiations and also a health check barometer for your current lease. In conclusion, here are 3 important reminders that will help you negotiate tenant-friendly lease terms. Firstly, remember that you get the lease you negotiate, not the lease you may deserve. Secondly, a tenant-friendly lease is much more than just getting a low rent. And thirdly, remember to use the LPC barometer to focus your negotiations. What should you do next? We suggest that you review User Guide 1.1 for full coverage of the tenant-friendly lease. And secondly, that you apply the LPC barometer and do a health check on your current lease. All the very best in your lease negotiations.